Today, I'm very excited to welcome Xuanyi to join us and give us this very interesting lecture. Xuanyi is an assistant professor in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at the University at Buffalo. He's broadly interested in the dynamics of power and agency in shaping equitable and healthy urban futures, with a transnational focus encompassing China, Southeast Asia, North America. And his scholarship explores the political economy of healthcare and social infrastructures and examines their transformative roles in urban and community development. Xuanyi holds a Doctor of Design and a Master of Architecture from Harvard University Graduate School of Design and a Bachelor of Architectural Studies from Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. He has held a postdoctoral research fellowship at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and has taught at the National University of Singapore, Roger Williams University, and Harvard University Graduate School of Design. So please join me to welcome Xuanyi for his guest lecture.
Hello, everyone. Good. So thank you, Professor Fei, for this warm invitation, and it's great to be here. I have previous training in architecture, so the Cornell's AAP is not something unfamiliar for me, including this lecture hall by Rem Koolhaas. So in general, I'm very excited to be here, and also excited about being here to share my research on this lecture. So essentially, this lecture is a combination of my three previously published or in the process of being published research projects. So I combine them into this lecture as a whole. All right, let's get it started. So I'm showing a diagram here. So for those of you who have done research in geography, sociology, political science, this is not something new, right? So it's a triangular relationship between the capital market, state authority, and social benefits. So as you already seen, today's talk is about healthcare infrastructures. So how do we situate healthcare in this, right? So instead of just putting healthcare in one of the edges of this diagram, I'm putting that in the center of it, because in my proposition, healthcare in itself is not neutral. Right? It always is being instrumentalized, or in itself is instrumentalizing other stakeholders and forces. So how do we understand it? Let me see if I can. Hello? Right. How do we understand it? Right? So for example, how do we understand healthcare in relationship with capital market, right? So it's an ideological question. Is healthcare a social benefit or is it a commodity, right? So people may have different opinions on it. Right? Some people say it's a right. Some people may say it's a commodity, right? So it depends on your proposition. Healthcare can be understood in relationship with as a commodity from the capital market, or it can be a right from social benefits as demanded by the people in general. But also, the state is an important sector in this, because despite the fact people may say, the United States has a very privatized healthcare industry, but you cannot say that the state does not have a role in this. So the state does play an important role in this. So often the case, healthcare is situated in contested and sometimes, hopefully, negotiated interest among the three stakeholders. But on top of it, I want to add another layer of thinking about it, is the territorial logic behind it. Right? How do we organize healthcare in terms of its provision and consumption? And it's highly related to the territorial logic, or territoriality and territorialization, right? And depending on how do we draw relationships among these important stakeholders, we have three ways of understanding it, which is also the proposition in this talk. First, statecraft. Right? Understand how healthcare is situated in between the state authority and capital market, organized by territorial logic. And similarly, if we look at speculation, how does the capital market and social benefits negotiate in this process in terms of providing and consuming healthcare? And then last, the state is often used territorial approaches as a way to organize the provision and consumption of healthcare, and I call it spatiality. But of course, this diagram is only one way of understanding the very complex relationships among the stakeholders, or it's just my proposition of understanding it. You may have very different understanding of it or critiques of it. I'm welcome all the different ideas. We can talk about it. But this provides a fundamental logic of organizing the logics and some fundamental elements in today's talk. And then in relationship with the three keywords here, statecraft, speculation, and spatiality, I'm providing 3 case studies with 3 different perspectives of understanding it. First, statecraft, right? In order to understand statecraft, one way is to understand statecraft through industrial policies, right? How does the state exercise political economic statecraft in terms of achieving its various purposes? And I'm using a case study in Shanghai. And second is a speculative tool. How did healthcare become a speculative tool for the state and capital market achieve their purposes, which does not necessarily conform with what the people really needs in terms of social benefits, right? And third is spatial strategy. How does the state, or in combination with other sectors, exercise territorial logics in terms of reorganizing a way to provide healthcare and to consume healthcare so that they can resolve some of the political and social economic crisis. Let's go into the first section, which is on statecraft. Okay, so in order to understand urbanism in China, I think I'm gonna need to provide a little bit of background. But for those of you who do Chinese research, this is not something new, right? Almost cliche. We have to start from the neoliberal shifts. From more like a managerial way of organizing social reproduction, consumption, and productivity in China to the post-reform, typically talking about the 1978 open market reform. Right? So, and then this is further related with the role of state in this process, right? So there are 3 keywords I'm highlighting here. First, re-regulation. Second, sponsorship, and third, supervision, right? So in order to understand why urbanization in China is so, I would say, fast, but at least high volume, right? One of the important factor is deregulation, right? So let's say a series of neoliberal reforms happens after the pivotal 1978 one, including the 1994 tax reform, 1998 housing reform, including state-owned enterprise reforms, and then later China joined the WHO and World Factory Model, etc. So all of those things require significant state deregulation in key industries and state resources. These include, right, land, political leadership, and of course, capitals, right? And also, for example, the real estate industry, so the private sectors can step their foot into this pond. And then also sponsorship. We ought to understand that in contrast to the prominent neoliberal shifts in the West, right? In the East, it's a little different, right? The state is not retreating. In fact, the state still has an important role in this. But people often call that sponsorship. What is sponsorship, right? It's basically backing up some of the deregulatory approaches and speculative actions of the markets by providing state leadership in this process. And that also comes with supervision, because this parental approach is essentially trying to avoid some of the crises that could happen in a not fully laissez-faire market, but let's just say deregulated market. And then third, a very important thing is landlordship, right? If we talk about growth machine, for example, a typical pro-growth coalition, right? It's local government, right? Local economic development and financial interests, and a very important thing is state and non-state landholders, right? So landlordship is very important here. And often the case in China, the landlord is the state, right? So how do we understand the 3 of them together in unison, right? So industrial policy. A lot of times, urban spatial production, urban development, or mega urban projects in China is a materialized form of the industrial policy, or in a lot broader term, the economic statecraft. For example, there are a lot of examples I can list. For example, special economic zones, mega event projects, infrastructure projects, right? And I'm now just listing one among the many, the Wuhan Optics Valley, for example, right? On the one hand, right, what does the state want? The state wants a technological independence, which is achieved through a deregulation of key resources and key industries. This would require, of course, the optics industry, and then capital investors who inject their capitals into this industry, and also land. So right, the optics valley, right, this kind of mega projects is not really the case of just a non-state actors approach, but rather it's a combination of the two in the making of something that is extra market. It's not purely driven by market interest, but also the economic statecraft in terms of achieving purposes that is beyond the market itself. So let's put healthcare into this logic, right? China's healthcare system does not exhibit a linear trajectory. You cannot say that, oh, it's a state-funded, it's a fully state-funded system, or now it's becoming a commodity. Like United States healthcare industry, it's not, a one word describes everything. So essentially, it's zigzagging between state dominance and market dominance. For example, let's start from the very early time after the country was established. Basically, in the planned economy, the country runs a publicly funded, fully government-funded public healthcare system, right? But things change, of course, according to the neoliberal reforms and etc. So between the 80s and 90s, with the deregulation, right, of the healthcare market, things changed. Healthcare became rapidly commodified, and it transitioned from a right to more of a commodity. And at the same time, hospitals, it's a caveat we'll return to later, will be queued a lot in today's lecture. Hospitals started running for-profit businesses. These include healthcare services that are not strictly regulated by the government, fee for service, for example, and also selling drugs and getting kickbacks from that. So these are all for-profit activities in this process. But those kind of transitions will eventually come at a cost, right? What is the cost? Starting from 90s, a lot of people started to realize, okay, so the country's economy was developing rapidly, but what about the social benefit, which was actually lagging behind? People called it's hard to access reasonably affordable healthcare at that time. So, of course, this kind of thing cannot, just be left there. Nobody takes care of it. So, in 2008, the Hu and Wen administration basically, who emphasized on harmonious society, if you guys are familiar with the history, right? They put an emphasis on remaking the healthcare system. So essentially, they established a multi-tiered public healthcare insurance system in China, which basically covers, it used to be 95% with solid data, but now I think it's gone up to 98%, essentially most of Chinese population in this. But that's not the end of the story, because if the state started providing a universal health care, there will also be issues with it. And one of the issues, after a couple of years after the system was established, was that healthcare expenditures started inflating. Why was that? Because there was very limited participation of private sectors, private insurances, private hospitals in this process, right? And providers operated at a very low margin. And the crisis was that healthcare costs started going up, right? So in order to fix that, starting from 2013, the state started a new round of healthcare reform, focusing on encouraging private actors in this process to build a what they call dual track system, right? On the one hand, there's a strong state dominance in the provision of reasonable quality, but universal coverage of a healthcare system and insurance. On the other hand, it's also encouraging more affluent population to go for private sector insurances and private hospitals to reduce the pressures, or especially fiscal pressures, on the state side. I mean, if you're familiar with, for example, the German model, right? Germany actually runs a healthcare system similar to this, right? China is trying to learn from that, right? And on top of that, right, social crisis keeps happening. Another one is the aging population, the rapidly aging population. And the state start to realize, okay, in itself is probably not going to be incapable of providing for the increasing demand of aging population, right? So the state is again encouraging private sectors to produce, for example, private nursing homes, gated communities for elder care, those kind of typologies to alleviate the pressure. Right, so before we go into the case study, another very important thing to talk about in China's healthcare system is the hospital-centric characteristics. China operates on a public tertiary hospital-centric system. This is actually a legacy from the neoliberal reforms in the 70s and 80s. Essentially, hospital at that time was deregulated, so people had the freedom to go to hospitals as the entry point for healthcare. It's very different from here, right? You have to go to a primary care, wait for a long time, and go to hospitals. In China, go to hospitals, and you queue in the line. If you can get a diagnosis from a very top tier ranked hospitals, you're lucky, right? But anyway, so China's hospital is very dominant in the system, right? And in response, the private hospitals did not perform the way that was expected by the state leaders who initiated this reform. So in an ideal situation, private hospitals could attract more affluent populations from the base population to alleviate the pressure, right? But in fact, public hospital in China is so dominant that there's no way that private hospitals can compete against the public hospitals. This kind of thing actually was very apparent. Like I started interview for my research project, including this, in 2018, and in the past 7 years, I've heard and witnessed the transition attitude from it. Like in 2018, a lot of policymakers are like, okay, we gotta hope things might change. And soon as in 2020, 2021, they're like, let's just call this, public hospitals are the bowders in a glass vessel, meaning that there's no way you can remove them. If the market is water in a bottle, right, the bowders are not gonna be moved. The only way for private institutions to survive in the system is to find the niche market, essentially the interstitial space between the bowders. And that's the case. So private hospitals in China usually seek for what? For competitive differentiation, basically to secure the niche market where the public dominance is weaker. Right? So what are the niche markets? For example, cosmetics, right? Make people beautiful. And also ophthalmology, right? OB and GYN, right? Those are where the where the public dominance is weaker and people are willing to spend money on, and where the private sector is willing to step in. And also the margin is higher because those sectors are the areas where it's easy to put in supply-induced demand, let's say this way, right? Putting a lot of high technologies which can yield in higher margins. And then that's basically one of the reasons for this dual track, right? Universal coverage, but with basic quality plus a self-financed high quality, which did not really go the way that was expected. For example, in the German model. And what's the product? One example is specialty care, which is run by private sector. Another example is international hospitals, right? I'm showing an example of Shanghai Jiahui International Hospital, which is actually one of the very first legitimized, licensed international hospitals in China. Okay, now let's go to the first case in Shanghai, which is the Shanghai New Hongqiao International Medical Center. It's located in Minhang District in West Shanghai. So if you guys who know more or less about Shanghai or the uneven geography of healthcare provision in Shanghai, so the provision is very good. The quality is very good in East Shanghai, basically covering the Pudong and Puxi, right? And then Shanghai actually started this project in conjunction with another international medical center. It's called the Pudong International Medical Center, which is hoping that it can anchor to the large amount of population inflow from the Pudong International Airport, right? It's more like, TOD development, right? You're hoping this huge inflow of population can drive up international medical tourism. But on the other hand, the state also designating another project on the west side to create this dumbbell diagram. Essentially, right, on the east side, right, you're providing high quality medical tourism for international population. On the west side, you're also providing high quality private care for another population. Who can those be? Probably domestic medical tourists. Why is that? Because that's where the Hongqiao transportation hub is located. That's the terminal of the high-speed railway bullet train in Shanghai, and also plus an airport, more likely serving domestic flights there. Right? So very different functions of these two nodal points if we think about the territorial arrangement on this map. And the map on the right was a satellite image of what the campus looks like. I promise you, it will look different now. So that's the map I got 2 years ago. I think now Google Maps should be able to update it because I checked often and they don't really update the area here. So it looks like the area is all in construction, but that was the case in 2020, 2021. But now a lot of the hospitals are already built and in operation. So how does the K respond to the dual track system, everything we talk about? Right? The first is to understand it as a agglomeration for high quality care industry. Right? So the campus itself is a conglomerate of private specialty hospitals. I'm listing all of them here. I'm not going to read all of them, but you can just see that what kind of sectors are those hospitals in, right? They're in cosmetics, in children's hospital, OB/GYN, cancer hospital. This Concord Cancer Hospital is very interesting. It's actually established in partnership with MD Anderson Cancer Center, right? And also orthopedics and rehab hospital, plus and general international hospitals, Parkway Hospital, a hospital group in Singapore. So it's actually servicing international populations because it's not included in basic public healthcare insurance schemes in China. And it's not saying that public hospitals does not play a role in this. Actually, the Huashan Hospital affiliated to Fudan University has a branch hospital here, but it's called large specialty plus small general. Why is that? Right? Because you need to have a public hospital here to leverage key state resources, right? The states can give you subsidy if you have public hospitals in an area. But this public hospital kind of defies the very purpose of establishing a cluster of high quality care hospitals, right? So it's also a large specialty. So if you check the services provided at this hospital, it's actually the neurological department of the Huashan Hospital main campus, which is in Shanghai city center. Right, so you see how that, the public-private actors kind of negotiated here in order to maximize its gains from the state and market. Yeah, and the state plays a very important role in the making of these projects. I think the first thing we need to talk about here is the state financing agency. But if you guys are familiar with, again, China's financialization instruments, it's called SASAC, right? State Administration, State Assets Supervision and Administration Commission. Right? It's a very important actor in mega project financialization in China. It's essentially mobilizing state resources, including land, assetized land, in particular, to facilitate the financialization of a lot of mega projects. And it's also the case here. The Shanghai Minhang District SASAC established a intermediary company, right, which also established a third-tier subsidiary company, which has various levels of equity holdings among all these hospitals. So those hospitals are private hospitals developed by private sectors. But I think in the beginning, the story was the way that the hospitals would be fully privatized. But it did not work that way because, think about it, if you are a patient looking for high-quality healthcare, especially in China's market, people are still very stubborn about getting the prestigious state-funded hospital services. So one way you could do it is to brand your private hospital with public hospitals' names. That's how it works here, right? So on the one hand, the hospital is developed by a private sector, but it's also allowing a bit of equity investment from the public sector, and that's technology, right? Key techniques which are assetized into equity in this process. And then the state is diffusing its supervision through the intermediary to these hospitals, private specialty hospitals. At the same time, the private specialty hospitals need the sponsorship from the state, particularly the public hospitals, right, to back their services. So this is a privately developed, a public operated model here. And then another thing here is that how does the hospital or the larger concept become a territorial approach in this, right? First, as we talk about, is to balance the provision of healthcare services to address the social issues of inequality in the provision of healthcare. Typically, it's in the Minhang district in the west versus Pudong district in the east. Another thing is that the SASAC and its subsidiary state-owned enterprises, they are in charge of the provision of key infrastructures in this campus. By providing key infrastructures, it's a way to alleviate the initial lump sum cost from the private sector to attract investment from them in the making of a self-financed high-quality sector here. So this campus is actually designated by Shanghai Minhang district government and as well as the Shanghai municipal government as one of the national key projects. There are a lot of national key projects in China anyway. But although they are ubiquitous, but this means a lot. Right? It's recognized by the state. It has the leadership support from the state, so it's very important. Right? So on the one hand, the state sponsorship comes from the public hospitals. On the other hand, the state financialization goes through the intermediaries into the private sector. Right? That's a way of how does the state utilize financial instruments to resolve the possible market failure, to avoid possible market failures. And second, let's talk about how does healthcare and the territorial approach become a speculative tool. And I'm using another case study in Peking University Healthcare City as an example. Right, so as I lightly touched before, so in order to understand why China's urbanization process has been so significant, one of the very important things is urban growth machine, right? It involves local governments, landholders, and localized economic and financial interests, which unifies them all. Right, in China it's the same, right? Local states, the capital, landholders, right, economic, financial interests, they are unified in the making of proactive and speculative urban projects in China, which includes, for example, large residential developments, right, real estate properties, right, mega events, infrastructure in order to promote local economic growth, right, and also various of very interesting mega projects, this town, that town, those kind of things. And then also it's coupled, this logic is coupled by China joining WTO and mastered the world factory model, plus the global financial crisis stimulus package in 2008. So those 4 trillion Chinese yuan was injected in the market. Right? If you're familiar with David Harvey's circuit, capital circuit, you can understand, right? Money is there, it's flowing in the market, right? It's a surplus. How does the surplus get absorbed? Yeah, the built environment's easy, right? So those money got supervised by local governments and then to be invested in local economic developments and spatial production, etc. Right? So again, I'm using Beijing Central Business District as an example, right? The local government is eager to show off its international reputation, to build, to facilitate the modernity project, to attract foreign investments, right? And the foreign capitals are eager to step in this new market, which is being heavily deregulated for higher margins and returns. And that really facilitated the building, of CBDs like this, right? This is just one of many, right? One of many, right? You can show a picture of Shanghai, for any other major China's major cities, right? It was high rises plus large volume developments, the same. But on the unifying logic is not that different, right? Proactive large scale urban development and redevelopment. However, right? If we're just saying this is the case, it's kind of simplifying the story here. It's kind of neglecting the role of state, right? What does the state do, right? The state is never absent in this process. Despite the fact that state deregulated key industries in the making of cities, right? It still controls a lot of things. And it's got to understand what is the state, right? And this is not a political economy talk, so I'm not an expert of that, so I'm not going to embarrass myself by talking about this. But one way of understanding it is that the state, instead of understanding as a monolithic entity, a singularity, for example, it's a polity, a collection of negotiated, contested interests, which usually involves scales, right? The central, meso, and local. And in China, China's institutional setting can be characterized by a central-local relationship. And the central government is interested, the national government is interested in a lot of things, For example, economic, political statecraft, foreign policies, right? Those larger, broader things. But local governments, they probably not going to be so driven by that, because local cadres, local officers are driven by some other logics to be promoted to the central office, to the central government. For example, if we assume that the system really runs in a meritocracy, a merit-based system, right? So local governments are probably more interested in local economic development, right? So localities are empowered in this process, but they are also compelled by the central government to do things that are not usually the things that they are interested in. Right? For example, the central government say, okay, now we are entering economic austerity, let's prioritize social stability. But that's kind of asking local governments to cut off its margins, right? To retreat from speculative development, if there's any, right? To prioritize social stability, which kind of contradicts with what it wants. So local governments often have to innovate and exercise policy entrepreneurship in this process. And another very important tool by the central government to control this, to permeate its influence in this process, is land control, right? A very key state resource, right? The central state owns the land. So if you want to engage in development, you need to get the land quota from the central government to engage in local development. But how does that work, right? If you just say, we're going to build another speculative project, and really it's a housing, which we're going to sell for very high margin. The central government be like, are you joking? This is not what we need to do. We need to prioritize social stability, or we need to prioritize certain industries. For example, optics industry we just talked about. So now in China, local developments often involve what is called a right rhetoric. You got to give it a right name to get the project done. So that's why we see that in China, a lot of projects are called this city, that city, right? Eco-city, university, new towns, education city, blah, 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 or hot spring city sometimes, right? You can understand as a way as the spatial production is a materialized contestation of interest between the local and central government, right? On the one hand, local government use the term, the right chameleon-like term, saying, in this spatial production project, we're gonna prioritize certain industry. On the other hand, the central governments will be backing for this, be like, okay, this is good, that's what we want, so let's deregulate land for the development. Everybody's happy. But is that the case, right? But a lot of times, if you practice as architects in China, especially involved in the zoning regulations, you probably understand that sometimes the priority is to get the land, and then you can always exercise rezoning later to change the prior zoned project to something else. So that's where some speculations could happen because of the scale, right? The scaling of the governmentality, the central state does not necessarily always be able to supervise what exactly is going on the ground. So that leaves some certain space for localities to speculate, right? And how do we, again, situate healthcare in this practice? And we need to understand that hospitals, specifically in this case study, hospitals and universities in China, especially the publicly funded ones, are not just the good kids of the state. Right? They have their own pursuits. They have their own speculative pursuits, to be specific. They're entrepreneurial. This is also related to a series of reform policies in China. So before, again, in a state-dominant era, those publicly funded institutions are being so taken good care by the state. But then neoliberal reform came. Things change. Right? They have to make a living by themselves. Public hospitals, they are state-owned, and they are non-profits, and with tax-exempt income. I made a little typo here. Sorry about that. But they have very strong autonomy in terms of navigating in the healthcare market. Right? The tax exemption is something very important here, right? So in the United States, non-profit hospitals also enjoy tax breaks, tax benefits. It's very similar in China. For example, in China, there's something called value-added tax, VAT. So if it's a hospital, no matter it's for-profit or non-profit, VAT for healthcare services is exempted. And for-profit hospitals, right? The drugs are not exempted. And corporate tax, for-profit, non-profit hospitals are exempted from corporate tax. And income tax, everybody has to pay, right? Because it's not so much about the corporation, it's about individuals. A very important thing here is tariff. Right? Think about it. If a hospital import large, expensive instruments, which actually quite significant, because for example, very expensive MRI machine could be $1 million. And think about the tax here, right? If you pay 30%, 25% of the tax, that's a lot. But for non-profit hospitals, this tax is also exempted because they are usually the teaching hospitals. So if they teach, there is a justifiable excuse for those taxes to be exempted. Right? So that's providing a lot of incentives for hospitals, public hospitals, to engage in healthcare businesses. On the other hand, very similarly, public universities, they're prestigious ones, right? So if you want to go through the high school examination exam, of course you want to go to public universities, right? The 211, 985, those universities. But they have very limited income sources to support a lot of activities, right? They don't not only have to pay salaries, they also want to be in the market. But are you going to just rely on tuition? No, it's not enough. So a lot of times they establish what is called university-run enterprises to be in the market. So I'm listing some of the important ones here. For example, Tsinghua University, the best, right? Arguably the best, has its own university-run enterprise called Tongfang. And this was established in 1989, before it was called the Human Environmental Engineering Company. And then in 1997, the university established the Tongfang Group and merged the prior engineering company. And then later it became a listed company in the market. And then Peking University also has its own founder, Peking U founder, was established in 1986, but went into bankrupt, corporate reorganization in 2020. That was unfortunately also the time when I was doing the field work for this project, for this research project. So it was very hard to actually interview my prior contacts in the company. But anyway, that's another story. Levono, also it was established in 1984 by the Institute of Computer Science of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. And then in 1989, it changed to its current form, Lenovo. And another thing, if you guys practice architecture, right, you know this Shanghai Tongji Urban Planning and Design Institute. It was established in 1994 by Tongji University. Actually, if you walk around those universities with architecture schools, often the case you will find more or less, some of the similar planning, design institutes, architecture including, around the campus, because they are often case in an earlier time established by the university, and later, reform happens. They might be independent, privatized, right? But it's not the case for all of them. But anyway, with those powerful instruments, universities and hospitals, public ones, resemble powerful state-owned enterprises in the market. So let's go to this case study here. So map on the left shows where the case study is, the red dots, right? So it's actually in a not very easy to get to place in Changping district, quite far from the Beijing center. It's funny, the land initially was given to Tsinghua University to start its industrial park. But then later on, through a series of allocation, reallocation, negotiations, land got into the hand by Peking U Founders Group. And they they initiated this healthcare city project, which is shown on the right. And you can see from the boundary that it's not like a typical Chinese block, right? Square block, squared out, the space territorialized. It's actually a conglomerate of several mega projects as a part of a larger campus here, which is the Tsinghua University Industrial Park that I was talking before. And then the concept of university is not something very new. And here, the university hospital conglomeration is also making a university under the name of Peking University, right? Because if you look at the mega projects in this campus, all of them all of them has a name brand of Peking University in front of them, right? The Peking University International Hospital, for example, right? The Science Park, the Resource Health Industrial Park, and the Care Innovation Park, all branded by Peking University's name. And they are also designed by companies that has Peking University's name in it. Right? That will start to intrigue us to think about why, how, right? How does Peking University get into this? And then you look at the picture of Peking University International Hospital. You see those, there are several tall buildings on the edge of it, right? Those are actually for rent offices. And then on the right, the hospital, which has a significant size, is also astronomical in terms of its size, right? It has a couple thousand of beds, which is in the inpatient building, which is like a long wall of it on the right side of it. Again, let's look at the organizational diagram of this process, right? On top, we have Peking University. It's state-owned, right? And it has state assets. So first, it established a company, right? A Peking U Asset Management Company, of course, like a subsidiary to be in the markets and control through its equity holding. Right here is 100% equity holding. And then the management company also established the Peking U Founder Group, right? The university-run enterprise we talked about before. And the Founder Group, together with Peking University, established the Peking U Resource Group, thereafter called Peking U Resources. And then Peking U Healthcare Industry Group. Those are the very important key actors in the making of this campus. So through the equity holding structure, you've got to understand that it's heavily controlled, influenced by Peking University and subsidiary corporations. And then Peking Healthcare in this process, they were in charge of the development of the international hospital, the innovation park, and Peking Resources was in charge of the development of the Boya CC Center and the Peking Resources Health Industrial Park. Right, so if you are familiar with corporate law, right? So equity here signifies power, signifies control, right? If you own more than 66% of the equity of a company, that's an absolute holding. That means that you can make, pretty much make a decision that influences the operation of the company. And then if you own more than 50%, that means you have significant influence over the company, right? In the board, especially. If you own more than 30%, that means you have a veto, right? You can veto the things. So those are the three important figures. And if you have a little bit of less of the equity holding, probably means you can be on the board, but not sure how much influence you have in this process. So what is the university, what I call a university hospital nexus here? What does it do, right? It does three things. First, it's consolidating shareholder interests, right? So in this, healthcare businesses, healthcare practice and property development practices are unified in this, right? Especially it's the Peking U Resources. It does not call itself a real estate developer. In fact, it calling it an industry industry research integration, 产生融合. So it's not just developing properties for residential use or etc. It's actually developing properties for research and technology. That's very important. And this thing gets integrated in the overall logic of why we have a university here. And second is to brand healthcare businesses. Peking U founder, when I was interviewing with the former president of Peking University, she told me that the Peking U founder administratively was at the same level with Peking University Medical School, right? So what happened in the making is that in 2002 or even earlier, Peking U founder sensed the opportunity in the healthcare market. So it just went ahead, established this very early initiative, and then used the brand name of Peking University. And Peking University people later found out their name got borrowed, but it's too late. There's nothing they could do, right? Except for sitting on the table and talk about how we divide the revenues and the benefits, right? So it was, so Peking U founder as the university-run enterprise has access to those key resources owned by universities to brand its practice. And the third is to camouflage profit-driven developments, right? In fact, for this kind of development, the state holds the land, And how do you leverage it? Is to use the name of healthcare, right? Now we integrated research, healthcare, and land development. We're going to call it a healthcare industry-driven development, which fits into the state's non-market agenda. And the city be like, hey, I'm going to deregulate the land for me. So it's important, right? It's important for the state to back this kind of project by giving land allotments, right? And also, the Peking founder was able to debt finance from the central bank. Think about it. The Peking University International Hospital in 2003 was like 45 billion Chinese yuan of debt. That's a lot of debt. But Peking founder successfully got the debt. So having this political back for this development is very important. But it does not negate the fact that this project still has speculative components there. In fact, when I was interviewing, a lot of those industrial park offices and science park offices were actually for profit. If you check online for real estate agents, you can actually find out a lot of the units are actually for sale. I'm not sure how far is across the line, but that's what it is. And if you get into the offices, you see that a lot of the units are actually rented for businesses that are just not relevant, right? They're like high school training programs, right? Hobby training offices, those kind of things. And one of the reasons is that this project did not go as what everybody was expected before. It's not saying that, okay, they don't care about having actual innovation here. They did care. I actually found out in a lot of offices, people actually engage in hardcore chemistry, biomedical research. But the capacity was not there yet. In order to get the units ran out, you got to eventually have to make concessions a little bit, so other industries can step in to rent offices. So in general, the project's not in deficit. So it's hard to say, right? On one hand, yes, there are some speculation going on, but on the other hand, maybe it's driven by the private sector's speculation in the first place, or it's driven by the market in general. Okay, the third case study. Spatiality. How do we understand the state and the state in organizing healthcare as social benefits in a larger territorial approach? But again, it does not say it's just between the state and social benefits, right? When I drawing the diagram, you see capital, state, and social benefits. They are always there because it's not just we cannot just isolate any from this integrated approach framework because the three of them are always constant, always present in this negotiation. So healthcare, and how we understand that's in relationship with spatial strategy. Healthcare provision is usually localized, right? So individual municipalities are in charge of the provision of the healthcare services within their administrative boundaries, or if you call that territories. Because there is an uneven development of economics across space. Right? So that means municipalities' ability to provide healthcare also vary across space. So there's an uneven distribution of medical resources across China. And that will lead to people move around to be able to access healthcare resources they wanted to. Right? And the state also realized this case. So they also promulgated policies to deregulate this and actually to encourage this. So one example is the ED-就医, the translocal medical utilization policy, to allow people from different cities, provinces, to have their healthcare interests reimbursed, even though they spend in another jurisdictional boundary, within another jurisdictional boundary. Right. So here, a recent research showing the pattern of intercity patient mobility in China, which is quite significant. Right? The major cities are absorbing a lot of patients who look for high-end care in public hospitals, more likely, because that's where the state resources are concentrated, right? And that would also lead to people leaving their cities, localities, in the pursuit of those care, right? And if we think about this, healthcare in relationship with broader geography and territory in China, right? You got to recall important scholars, for example, Caroline Cartier, who says that state power in contemporary China is a geographic problem, right? The states, again, what is a state, right? The state or statehood is a process of constantly exercising the territorial approach to resolve various political, economic, social crises, right? And the determination and redefinition of boundaries, administrative boundaries and territories is a very important instrument here. And then, how do we understand the making of this kind of territory? Right? It can be understood through the movement of things. For example, Foucault in his Security of Space mentioned that. How do we understand territories? Through the movement of various human and non-human objects in the process. What are those? If we talk about healthcare, right? We have patients, right? We have medical technology, and we also have capitals. And usually, if you have mobility of patients, the later two will more likely to happen because patients are the ones who go in there, spend money, right? So money travel with the patients, right? And again, back to the hospital-centric system in China. This is a diagram characterizing the distribution of healthcare resources in China. It's a reverse pyramid, right? Primary care facilities are very weak in China, very weak, right? They don't provide high-quality services, and people do not trust them. Right? In fact, the state is trying to reverse the pyramid, right? Because the optimal distribution is the pyramid. The optimal distribution is the pyramid shape. But it's going to take time. So now tertiary public hospitals are still dominant in the system. So instead of putting more resource to reverse the pyramid, another approach is 一连体 or 一共体, right? It's a horizontal, vertical medical alliance between hospitals. Okay? Now, think about it. You are given a number of very good hospitals across the geography of China. All right, what are you going to do, right? One way to, in my understanding, a temporary approach is to use them as regional nodes, right? To attract patients from the less well-off municipalities who look for healthcare resources, right, in an integrated way. So instead of just dividing hospital services in terms of the borders, administrative borders. Now the territory is redefined by how much of a radial effect, a spillover of those key hospitals can have through this policy instrument to integrate regional resources so that it can resolve, right, the social crisis of uneven distribution of healthcare resources, which is largely a result of the uneven development of economics. So how does hospital play a part in this, right? Because hospital is state-owned. But you got to also understand, hospital is state-owned, but through the neoliberal reform, hospitals also have their ways of navigating through the market. Let's take the United States as an example, or in Europe as an example. Hospital corporatization is not something new. Again, usually entrepreneurial hospitals will go through corporate reforms to become separate legal entities to be able to operate in the market. And this is often coupled by a horizontal consolidation of independent hospitals through mergers and acquisitions, and also vertical integration, for example, of physician practices to consolidate the types of healthcare resources available. These two are not separate. Usually, the both of them contributes to a geographic understanding of this process, right? If a hospital wants to secure patients in a certain locality, one way is to, okay, let's get this, let's M&A with this hospital here, so both of us can share the patient pool from our referral networks. But another way is also to acquire a physician practice, because the physician practice would also have its own referral networks. So both of them are territorial approaches of consolidating geographic markets. And this process often involves equity financing, right? Because you want to M&A with something, right? You need the capital to do it. You got to leave space for the capital investors to be in it. Right? So equity holders in this process were more likely to be part of this because they seek profits from M&A, which increases the margin. But then the problem of this is, of course, equity investors. A lot of them are individual investors. They don't care so much about the industry in itself, what they want is higher margins. So they are profit driven. So this could also lead to some problems of increased healthcare cost, which is something has been criticized in the United States healthcare market. And then in China, it's also the same thing. Chinese hospitals can also have this kind of practice to go through corporate reforms and to consolidate different various geographic markets in this process. And a question is it a state space? Does the state play an absolute role in this, in the making of a state space? Or it's led by the private sector in the making of non-state space? That's a question. So now here I'm listing an example of the Massachusetts General Hospital and Brigham Women's Hospital. Right? In 1994, because of various political economic pressures to cut the cost, the two hospitals merged into a perennial corporation called Partner Healthcare. And then later in 2019, the name changed to the Mass General Brigham. So that is a very typical example, not the only one, but very typical example of how how hospital corporatization could happen. Okay, so the third case study is on these two hospitals, the Nanjing Drum Tower Hospital and the former Suqian People's Hospital. And then both hospitals have pretty significant history in terms of modern China. So the Nanjing Drum Tower Hospital was established in 1892 by a doctor from Ontario, Canada, called William Macklin. And it was one of the very first Western-style hospitals in China. On the other hand, the former Suqian People's Hospital, it was called Renji Hospital, and it was established in 1905 by the Southern Presbyterian Church of the United States. And before 1996, 1997, Suqian in Jiangsu province was a county. Right? So this hospital was a county-level hospital. And after 1997, the Suqian becomes a city, a municipality in Jiangsu province. So this hospital also became a prefecture-level hospital administered by the municipal health bureau. So now I'm showing a map of how the Nanjing Drum Tower Hospital practices territorial approach. So the very key actor here is Nanjing Drum Tower Hospital Group. It was established first, a conglomerate established in 1994 by 4 hospitals: Children's Hospital, Nanjing Children's Hospital, Stomatological Hospital, Chest Hospital, and Nanjing Drum Tower Hospital. And after about 10 years, in 2005, after a series of operations, this conglomerate was legitimized by the Nanjing municipality as a business entity, right, licensed, right, to engage in the private market. And since then, the hospital has been practicing territorial expansion through mergers and acquisitions, typically through the corporatization of former public hospitals. And this strategy not only happens within the jurisdictional border of Jiangsu province, it even went across the Jiangsu province to Anhui province, right, to some cities, for example, Chuzhou, Anqing, Ma'anshan, those cities in Anqing province. But people joke about how this province used to be together. But it does not say that this kind of expansion is not significant. In fact, this is what we're going to talk about in this case study, is that when a weak state wants to push forward some new reforms, what could happen, right? And in this territorial expansion of the hospital group, Suqian was the pilot of this. Again, organizational structure. If you want to corporatize a state-owned hospital, what are you going to do? You're going to start a board, right? You establish a board. So now this is how the board is established, right? In this corporate reform of the Suqian Renmin Hospital, the 3 key actors: the first, Nanjing Drum Tower Hospital; the second, Suqian local government; and the third, Jingling Pharmaceutical Company, which you can see that as a private investor here, equity investor. It has 63% of equity holding in this process, in the making of this new hospital, whereas the Suqian local government has 27%, which now has increased to 30%. And Nanjing Drum Tower Hospital had 10%, now reduced to 7%. But it did not mean that the Nanjing Drum Tower Hospital actually invested money in this process. Most of the money was given by Jinling Pharmaceutical in the acquisition of this process. And the Suqian local government holds a certain percent of equity to avoid a pure privatization in this process. What did Nanjing Drum Tower Hospital invest? Technology and brand. Those were, again, assetized as a key resource or financial resource in this process. And then let's look at the board. Jinling Pharmaceutical, as the major investor here, of course has a say in this, because equity involved corporate reforms does not give equal right to everybody. It depends on how much of equity you hold. So Jinling Pharmaceutical, as the larger equity holder, of course has a larger say in this. So Ni Zhongxiang, who was the CEO of Jinling Pharmaceutical, was designated in this process as the chairman of the board. And this is followed by Ding Yitao, right, the former president of Nanjing Drum Tower Hospital, which is designated in this process as the VP. And then the members are all, more members are given by all the three entities in this process. And then under that, there's also management team. Again, the three parties designate their individual members in this. And see, Jinling Pharmaceutical is actually given a lot of attention in this process, right? So the former VP, vice party secretary of the party committee of the Jinling Pharmaceutical was also designated to be the party secretary of this hospital, right? And came with him was the also financial advisor from the company to be in charge of the operation. So you see, in this kind of board setup, operation, management, and supervision are kind of divided through this equity holding and board design among the three entities. And in this, the Nanjing Drum Tower Hospital, although only 10% of equity holding in this, it has a major saying in the patient, medical professionals, and technologies, because it's branded by this hospital. They rely on this, right? The entire corporate reform relies on the brand and name of this hospital. And Jinling Pharmaceutical is in charge of the management and business decisions, and the local government provides the political leadership. In fact, here I'm going to talk a little more about the political leadership, right? Because this kind of reform requires very strong, charismatic, innovative leaders. I'm naming He Qiuhe, right? He was the former party secretary of Suqian City, and also the director of the health bureau in Suqian, Ge Zhijian. Well, both of them are arrested now for different reasons. But Qiuhe, right, was a very strong leader during that time. If you need neoliberal reforms, right, you need a strong leader to push forward. This guy was the one, right? During his term, he promulgated a number of policies for neoliberal reforms. For example, merit-based local officer promotion system in Suqian, and also including this corporate reforms of state-owned assets, including schools and hospitals. So hospitals are part of it. And this is also supported by the local leader of the health bureau, Ge Zhijian, in this process. So there's a little bit of a scalar jump in this. So in my interview, Qiuhe made a promise to the provincial government saying that there will be economic development in this process. My reform will bring economic developments in the city. All I need is your support, your saying, right? Your acknowledgement of my reform strategies. And then it was a coalition started. The provincial government's like, okay, yes, you convinced me. Let's do this. And then Qiuhe approached Ding Yitao, who was the former president of Nanjing Drum Tower Hospital. And according to another interview, Ding Yitao felt that this talk was more like a political pressure, right? And both of them, after some level of agreement, went to Ni Zhongxiang, the chairman of the new hospital, to push forward this, right? So despite the fact that Suqian during that time was a weak state, right? The fiscal income was low. They had to push forward for a number of neoliberal reforms to get better economic development. But this kind of state sponsorship is very important, right? And later on, this hospital reform turned out to be a success for a number of years. And then in 2015, 2014, Qiu He was trying, when he was promoted, he later was promoted to be in the provincial commission in Yunnan province, right, where he started to try this reform again, to start a corporate reform of the local hospital. But it failed. It didn't work. And then just 1-2 years later, he got arrested because of corruption. So some speculation here, but probably there's something happened. In fact, a lot of people complain about this corporate reform of local hospital, right? The Suqian municipality used to be a fan of this, but now they changed their attitudes because since 2018, the state again was encouraging public tertiary hospitals to be the key actors in regional development. Remember, we were talking about the policies, the territorial approaches to consolidate regional development. And then the central state was giving out subsidies for localities which had public hospitals. Suqian did not have public hospitals. They missed the chance, right? So Ge Zhijian in 2015, at the same time, realized this. And he pushed forward this, let's build a new public tertiary hospital in Suqian. This hospital was just finished and now it's in operation. Right after Ge Zhijian signed a policy for building this new hospital, he got arrested for, again, corruption. Right? So you see, in this kind of healthcare policies, reform policies, it did take some courage to be part of it. Win it all or lose everything. But anyway, so if you look at the intentions behind them, we have a better understanding of how this territorial approach works. First, for Nanjing Drum Tower Hospital, it's through a geographical market consolidation. Right? Because it's Nanjing Drum Tower Hospital. It's not the provincial first or provincial second hospital. Right? There are differences in it. Right? The Nanjing is funded and administered by the municipality, whereas the later is usually by the province. So the amount of state sponsorship is different, especially financial sponsorship. And also consider the complicated history of Nanjing as the former capital, right, where the funding was a lot during the former term and now got cut a lot. So that puts this hospital also in an aspiration for business approaches to expand its market. So it went in. And for Jinling Pharmaceutical Company, yes, a superficial way to understand it is geographic market consolidation, right? Because Jinling Pharmaceutical used to be reliant on this injection medicine called melanin, which is basically a cardiovascular injection medicine, right? But through an interview, I found out there are deeper reasons behind it, right? So during that, in early 2000, melanin was in hot sale, right? It was doing good. But the board member was not very happy with it because the company has surplus of cash flow, but nowhere to invest. They wanted higher margin. In order to alleviate this pressure, the board made an audacious decision that let's get into hospital business. Let's build this. And it worked, right? So this is also a capital switching, right? But instead of holding cash flow, right? This hospital business became one way of absorbing the surplus, right? To resolve this board member crisis here, right? And last, Suqian local government and Suqian People's Hospital. There are a conglomerate of interest coalition here, right? First, Suqian local government was trying to promulgate its reform policies based on two things. First, Chinese localities are very great in inventing those terms. Fascinating. I think my translation does not capture it, but it translates the literal meaning of it. Expanding new capacities and revitalizing existing inventories. Expanding new capacities basically means to try to work with different sectors to try to find new niche markets. Right? And revitalizing existing inventories basically means to reform the existing state assets, for example, hospitals. So that's the Suqian local government's reform policies. And Suqian People's Hospital, because it was operating very bad, I think in 2002, it had accumulated 80 million Chinese yuan of debts. It was running deficit, right? So it was eagerly seeking for some partners to help it. So it called itself looking for a strong, big external helper. And then Nanjing Drum Tower Hospital became this perfect partner for this. Right, see? So all of them are unified in a territorial logic here between a strong city and a weaker city, right? But on the city level, it's a way of coordinating different levels of healthcare resources and consolidating healthcare markets in the process, right? And this is done through a territorial approach of the control of patients, medical technologies, and capital. It's also implemented through a board structure, right, among the three important equity holders. And all of them is trying to resolve two important crises. First, right, fiscal crisis, a weak locality, and also a social crisis, the provision of healthcare resources. So now let's go back to this diagram. I hope the three case studies provide you with a clear understanding of why I'm framing, right, all the actors in this diagram. I think the key takeaway here is that healthcare itself is never neutral, right? It's constantly instrumentalizing and being instrumentalized. In order to understand how healthcare infrastructure are territorialized, we have to understand the multi-layered contested interests among the very key actors, which here is categorized into state power, capital market, and social benefits, in terms of what interests they have and what instruments they use, combined with the territorial logic. Right? We can understand that how they exercise economic statecraft, for example, and real estate speculation, and how they all together come up with spatial approaches, spatialities in the making of arguably state or non-state spaces in terms of addressing the constant different crises in cycles. Right? So that marks the end of my talk. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Xuanyi, for this incredibly rich talk. Let's open up the floor for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand.
Good afternoon. My name is Abhiram. Thank you for the very rich and informative talk. Two questions. One, like at the end of this, like if you were to give maybe key takeaways or learnings that as planners that we should have at the end of this talk, like crisply, what would be those? And then if it were a polity that doesn't follow Chinese characteristics of functioning, how would the triangle change? Because there are going to be more actors than just the state and the private capital. So how does the triangle change, and how would this fit into, say, another, maybe a multi-party polity? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for this question. It's great. So on your first question, so I think, as urban planners, right? So one thing we're concerned the most is equity and equality, right, of provision of public services, and healthcare falls into this category, right? If you look at contemporary planning research on healthcare, for example, healthcare geography, healthcare mobility, a lot of them are talking about this is what we have, and how to make it better. We should do this, this, this. But this is addressing what we have. I think a takeaway from this lecture is to understand beyond what we have. There is a reason of how it ended up like this. I think addressing those key questions require a mentality that goes beyond just doing policy recommendations based on what we have, right? You need to look through this and understand, for example, what kind of motivations and interests of different key actors led to this distribution of things now we're seeing, right? So instead of just policy saying, okay, now we got to do this, in response to the reality we see. Another approach, or in my understanding, more profound approach, is to understand what are the motivations that led to this? How can we respond to those motivations? For example, talking about healthcare resources, localities, municipalities, right? You're going to understand why did local policymakers lead or promulgate some policies that address or choose not to address the phenomena we see, right? Perhaps the solution does not lie purely in, right, what we see. It's actually lies in, right, the policymakers' rationale of why they choose to do this in this way. So I think that's a challenge for contemporary urban planners to really to think beyond the data, quantitative data that we have. And the second is the diagram in itself. One thing that I'm trying to do in this talk is trying to make things simple. I acknowledge this could be simpler. I try my best, but maybe it can be simpler. Two things I learned as a junior scholar through my trajectory. First, write short. And second, make complicated theories simpler, right? So I believe, even in a different context, in another part of the world, although actors are different, I think you can categorize them based on their motivations, power, authority they have, right? And how they respond to different actors. I think the better way is still to think about how you can situate them in a simpler structure. I understand that it may change. For example, if in a context, for example, in Africa, right, where there are very strong powers being held by local tribes, right, this will change. Right? When talking about social benefits, you got to think about how does the tribal power comes into this, right? If you go to Southeast Asia, where there are compounds, right, informal settlements, you also got to think about, okay, how does informal settlement fit in this? Because those populations could be arguably the ones excluded from what we call social benefits, right? Because it's a select. Healthcare in itself is territorial. Healthcare in itself, spatial-wise, it's excluding and including, and population-wise, it's also excluding and including based on, different logics they have, right? So those will also be put into the triangle. But I think that's a good question. If a PhD student, I think that's a very valuable question to think about how there can be a design of triangle for this. But I mean, at least for China's setting, that's a diagram that I'm designing, trying to make it simple, right? This is also part I'm learning. I'd love to see, right, if there's anybody taking my diagram, building on that, or make a critique of it, saying, no, this is not the case. Let me draw a new project diagram and show you how it works. I'm happy to see that kind of thing work. But without a specific case providing, I don't think I can give you a very specific answer to your question, but I can tell you some thoughts that I have.
Hi, thank you for your talk. My name's Alex. I'm a first-year MRP student. And when you're talking about China and the processes of deregulation for the medical system, it's very interesting in the United States because that's kind of what our current government's trying to do, is create deregulation, turn it towards more like private insurance and private hospitals. And I was wondering what you thought of like the current healthcare system in the United States and how the processes function differently and how there isn't really like a strong like statewide medical system.
That's a tricky question, right? I don't think I'm so qualified to be a public health expert to make a comment on that. But I mean, people make critiques of American healthcare system, right? But I think, we can draw some similarities between the two institutional contexts. Similarly with China, we cannot say that the United States is run a purely privatized, commercial, market-based system, right? It has very significant state role in this Medicare, Medicaid. And in fact, in the early 60s, those programs were initiated, right, in response to the increasing demands from the society. But then you got to understand that, again, similarly, United States has gone through a series of neoliberal reforms, deregulation in the healthcare market to let the market to be part of it. That involves a longer talk of the history of healthcare system, which I don't think I'm the best person to talk about here. But again, I think the fundamental key logic here is that why did the state to choose so, right? So similarly, in China, in my talk, at least in the way I frame it, to understand the deregulation of healthcare market, you got to understand the statecraft, the political economic statecraft of the central government. How does healthcare become an industrial policy in the making of a healthcare industry, right? To make a dual track system. to alleviate the fiscal and social crisis that is happening. Right? Similarly, in the United States, think about it. There may be other reasons, right? Bipartisan debates, right? Voters, right? And also how the fiscal capacity is performing in terms of the Fed and the state governments, right? Those are the important reasons that drive a series of reforms. But another thing similar is that doesn't matter how the policy making context and policymakers differ from different contexts. There's one thing you got to be careful, because the eventual buyers, the eventual payers are us. Right? We're the ones who pay for that. So I think two things in your question. First, to understand the fundamental, the essential logics behind the policy making, why it end up in this way. And second, how does that affect the users, us, right? So those things are I think the two parts you can think about.
Hi, I'm Julian, a first-year MRP student. I'm wondering, I know that you talked about the idea of like healthcare campuses and the development of healthcare being sort of used. Your phrase was as a chameleon for private like housing development and other for-profit developments. Have Chinese state or federal governments in recent years, like I guess, caught on to this a bit more and a bit more careful about how they've supported or not supported those sorts of healthcare developments, or how has that shifted politically in recent years in response to this trend?
Thank you. That's a very good question. Yes, my answer is yes, of course. I mean, the central state, although scale-wise it's far, but it doesn't mean that it's done, right? So it knows what's going on through many years, what's happening on the ground, right? For example, now the priority of urban development in China is actually micro regeneration, right? That has some political institutional imperatives behind it. First, right, austerity, right? The post-COVID economy was, in austerity, led to many austerity policies that, for example, central governments strengthens the control of land for-profit development and put more priority into the making of affordable housing and social stability. And second, local governments cannot use the chameleon-like rhetorics that they had been using before. One of the reasons is actually, well, two reasons. One, they don't have land, right? And the second is that the market is not performing well. Before you start a speculative project, and there is a very strong market, right? That would be a seller's market. People will come in and be like, let me do this, let me do this. And for local state who holds institutional resources, that was an opportunity. But now the real estate market is withering. But people are choosing rather just to stabilize its cash flows and everything instead of engaging in audacious development. That's depriving the local government with the market instrument it used to have before, right? So combining those, local states had to find different ways to innovate their approaches in terms of fiscal income and everything, right? So yes, and then second, healthcare, yes and no. So one of the important things in the three case studies is that they are conjunctural studies, right? The Chinese study, I think because the policies are constantly being made and being changed and being remade, right? I think conjunctural studies is very important. You got to read policies and read different projects in association with this timing. For example, the Shanghai case study was a recent one, right? So it shows you that some of the recent efforts, endeavors the state was trying to make, it's trying to build the dual track healthcare system. And the second case study in Beijing was an early one, in the early 2000. Third, same in the early 2000, around 2003. What happened back in that time? SARS. 2002, 2003 was the time when China was hit by SARS. And Chinese government was like, this thing was scary. We got to develop a good healthcare sector, healthcare system to defend similar crises like this. That's why the state chose to deregulate the health market a lot and allows for-profit market coalitions. And now it's different. right? The COVID's gone, right? And some other instruments were discovered. And then, state sponsorship is into public hospitals and to consolidate their regional, territorial, radio spillovers in order to address a lot of crises that we see. So, that's okay. So maybe it's not so much a time for pro-market, for profit, pro-market coalitions again, right? So those things really, if I find a word to describe what is going on, I'll just call it a pendulum. It's constantly shifting, right? So that's my answer.
Yeah, thank you. Just one quick follow-up to that. You said that local governments don't have much land anymore to develop on. Is that because a lot of that land has been reclaimed by the federal government, or just because cities have become so dense in China?
Not reclaimed. The central land control has been strengthened.
Got it.
Right, two things. One I didn't talk about is in 1994, the tax reform, right? So 40% of the tax, 40 or less, remain at the locality, and more than 60% and higher of tax went to central. But local governments were empowered or compelled to do local economic development. So that made local governments powerful but deprived of financial resources. So they had to choose to sell land use rights. They had actually propelled to sell land use rights to engage in economic development, right? But now it's changed. The central government, 2 years ago, they changed the strategy again, right? So the land sales does not, the land use right sales does not get kept and retained at the local level. So that means even though local governments still do land sales, they don't get much of fiscal income, no extra budgetary income. Right? So what's the motivation behind that, right? And also central government is, becoming more scrutinous about what kind of projects are being engaged in local level to avoid real estate speculation, right? So land quota got restricted, revenue from land sale got restricted, everything got restricted. So they got to just change their statecraft to alternative ways.
Hi, thank you for the talk, Professor Nie. My name is Jing Peng. I'm also the first year MRP student. And just you talk about the Nanjing School Law Hospital Group. And I studied in Nanjing for 5 years. And I have a question because Nanjing now is constructing the Jiangbei North City or the new city. And I know that maybe the Gulo Hospital Group will has a plan to construct a new sector in the Jiangbei new city. And I was wondering what impact will it have on the balanced development of the medical resources in the old city part? Will this new hospital construction affect the concentration of the medical resources of the original old part? And the second question is that, as we all know, Chinese government always have a great ambition of building a new city, but maybe in the initial part, in the initial period or in the beginning 10 years, you will not have a very, you cannot see very big results or something like that. And regarding with this problem, when the Jiangbei new city is constructed and they plan to build a new hospital there, but I think, do you think is there enough population to support that and to support the concentration of such a new plan? Yeah, I just wondering what's your thoughts about it. Yeah.
Are you from Nanjing?
I'm not Nanjing.
You're not Nanjing. It's interesting to chose Nanjing as a case study. I think the answer is already in your question. Right? Does it have enough population to support it? I come from Nanjing. So the Jiangbei area, I'm very familiar with and been there a couple of times. One thing, the first impression is that it's empty. It's empty. So it's not working as well as how it was planned. In fact, again, history, conjunctural approach. A lot of the new city development happened during a time where the market was really bulging. And where there's enough demand, whatever we do is an opportunity. But then now Jiangbei development has been lingered for so long that it's now entered as an austerity development. Right, so I know some of the companies, startups who choose to be this valley, tech valley, whatever, in Jiangbei area. After 1 or 2 years, after the subsidies are taken over, they're gone, they moved. Nobody wanted to be there because there's nothing there. The city is also trying to build a train station there, hoping to bring more people from Anhui province and even up in the north, right? But does it work? Right? I think a very important question is, now we are entering a different, I would say world, but in a different scenario. So a lot of the state-driven approaches will need to be, more, carefully scrutinized, right? It's not like draw a line, it will happen. And now really take now it really requires what I call fine refinements. So refinement of existing assets is very important. I think micro-regeneration is actually a good approach. If you go to city center in Nanjing, actually I'm writing a paper of it. Silicon Valley in Nanjing, and urban redevelopment driven by innovation companies, right? A lot of the approach of a municipality is actually on how to revitalize, if I'm borrowing the phrase here, revitalizing existing inventories. When the state is weak, the market is weak, all you have is the good old things in your box. How do you make the larger pie from the things you have, instead of just more loans, more debts, expensive approach and build, because eventually it's going to crash. It's going to collapse, right? So it's interesting you chose this case study. You studied in Nanjing for 5 years, right? I think there's a recent paper on EPC actually talking about the Jiangbei development and how the state has a role in it. I encourage you to read it. Although it's a theoretical piece, again, talking about the cliche, sorry, I shouldn't say that, but talking about the long old story about how the state has a part in development. I think at least it gives you an understanding of what's the state rationality behind it, right?
Okay, thank you, Professor Nia, for your illuminating talk. I'm Jason, a senior majoring in economics and history. So my question is, how would your analysis of PRC healthcare in terms of spatiality be applied to the COVID pandemic in mainland China? And specifically, could you talk more about the practices of horizontal consolidation and vertical integration of the healthcare service through the lens of, for example, Fangcang Hospital and citywide lockdowns? Thank you.
Good question. I think, one thing about geographic approach through horizontal vertical consolidation is that it's essentially market approach. Every market approach has a characteristic, is that it takes time. It takes time, right? So for those kind of things, it takes 1 year is fast. 2 years is about normal. It can take longer. In crisis like COVID, you cannot just rely on this state market coalition to happen in a very short amount of time. So that's why I'm suggesting another word for you in terms of understanding spatiality, is mobilization, mass mobilization. There's actually another paper published by a scholar in Shanghai Jiao Tong University, Jia Yida. He talks about the political economy of COVID. I think it's very well written, because there are two key words here. First is legitimacy, right? How does the state gain its legitimacy by dealing with crisis? And second is miracle making, which is the essential logic of CCP, right? How the CCP gain its legitimacy is through miracle building, right? So associated with that is, first, you have to establish a logic, right? You have to establish an enemy, and then you conquer it, right? To make the miracle, and then legitimacy happens. So that's something you don't understand. And mobility, mass mobilization in terms of, for example, you mentioned Mount Fangcang, right? It's mobilized by the state, but it's not just by, and who are mobilized? They're not just hospitals. They're actually people, right? A lot of people, right? They are mobilized in the process of building and operating those Fangcang hospitals, right? If you look at watch documentaries and read policy reports about it, that's a significant amount of people involved in this process, right? How are you going to rely on hospitals? I mean, one critique, in fact, why post-COVID Chinese government is so putting so much effort on public hospitals is because it realized the limitation of private hospitals. In COVID, private hospitals were not playing pretty supportive roles compared to public hospitals, right? So in terms of understanding the territoriality of it, you got to mobilize people first, and you got to mobilize the existing healthcare resources, meaning doctors from the hospitals. You regroup them in a different territory. You provide service there. You build you circle the land as a territorial approach, as a base. You build those hospitals to provide care, right, for quarantine and everything, right? That's a way of understanding territoriality through mass mobilization, right?
Do we have a final question here? Okay.
Hi, thank you for your speech. My name is Hiran. I'm a freshman studying economics and government. I found the university-run enterprises, UREs, very interesting. Could you expand a little more on what are some because I thought that UREs are it's a phenomenon that's like these giant UREs are very specific to China. So are there some qualities that drove, or are there some motives that drove Chinese universities to start these UREs? And what are some characteristics that allowed these UREs to expand to this extent?
Thank you. A very specific question. Yes, similar to hospitals, any public funded institution in China. So the reform policy, neoliberal policies in the 80s and 90s really played an important role. So essentially the state wanted to cut spending, those public institutions. But the public institutions, because the market was deregulated, they also have the motivation to being part of it, to make profits. Because for example, right, the hospital, like a state-owned enterprise, used to be happily reliant on state funding and everybody's got taken care of. And suddenly, boom, the parent is gone. You're on yourself in the market. You got to find ways to make a living, and there's no money for you, right? The first, you got to try different ways. Somebody go into, you just find ways to make money, right? Wash dishes or something to make a living, right? Same with those state-funded institutions, right? The state funding got cut, but they also wanted to be in the market. In fact, they probably had already been in the market for a while, and then boom, the money is gone. Stay back policies are gone, but they got to keep the capital running. So they were eagerly to be part of the capital or to be more engaged in accumulation to be able to make the system running. So they started the university-run enterprise. In fact, this thing is very different from the United States, right? United States is called spin-off. You have a lot of examples of spin-offs, right? But they are now university-run enterprises. It's the legal system is very different, right? But in China, so a very common approach is called a white glove. Right? You got a white glove to do things. Right? I'm not saying university-run enterprise is a white glove, but it's an example of how a public-run institution, nonprofit, right, practices policy entrepreneurship to develop an effective instrument to fulfill its pursuits. So to answer in short, it's the state's retreat, cutting funding that made them to do this.
Great. Please join me to thank Xuanyi again for joining us.
Thank you.
So we are heading over to 105 in Sibley. If you are interested in joining us to have another conversation with Xuanyi, you can go there.